Please welcome Todd to S4 Stage 2.
Thank you. So to begin, we're going to talk today about the laboratory research that we did looking at hardware convergence. Specifically, we called this research convergent evolution. So before we begin, I want to define convergent evolution for you. We took a biological research on, or a biological perspective on this to start with. And it was the idea that in nature, organisms will develop common characteristics based on their ecosystem, drivers within their ecosystem. So if we use as an example the flying organisms that we have here on the slide, we have a bird, a bat, and a dinosaur. Despite the fact that there is vast amounts of time between when they evolved or came into being, they share common characteristics. Wings that are kind of arm and hand-like, that evolved with lighter bone structures, things of that nature. But it's not necessarily obvious that they would have in those cases, or in places where we wouldn't necessarily expect this to happen. When we took that look and tried to apply it to IT and OT systems, what we started to find was that similar factors started to occur. If we looked at older systems, a lot of the older systems didn't necessarily have this, but as time went on, they would slowly evolve within their sectors or within non-contiguous sectors. So IT and OT may share components. We saw things like this a long time ago with things like the RS-232 adapters from FTDI. Lots and lots of these chips ended up in products all over the place. A lot of it was due to costs and similar factors. As we moved on, we started to find that they were being disabled. This led us to the ideas that maybe we want to look into this. So what we're going to talk about for a little bit is the idea that how does this convergence affect us long term? Does it potentially increase our risks? IT tends to be very quick-paced. OT tends to be much slower-paced. So how does that affect us in the long run as to these convergence factors? Then we're going to talk about some places where we identified convergence, or we believe we identified convergence initially. And then we're going to talk about the follow-on steps that we took to look at whether or not we could ascertain out of documentation provided to us by our vendors if this convergence was happening, and where we identified places that we were unable to find this just based on the documentation. So why is convergence important? We all kind of understand that the products that we consume and the products that we have in our environments are only as secure as their weakest component. If that happens to be a subcomponent, that we inherit those risks along with it. So the question then becomes, does our documentation allow us to understand our systems at a depth that we need to really understand our environment's risk factors? And as we look at that, we started to ask ourselves, what are some corollaries to this? We were originally inspired by Heartbleed, shared vulnerability in libraries that went across a lot of our systems. It was very hard to patch. It was actually a little bit harder in some cases to patch for OT, but it wasn't as common in OT as well, because in some cases, maybe that just wasn't new enough. The components that we were using weren't quite new enough to have used this type of technology, or encryption might not have been needed. A little bit later on, we started to identify this more and more through software vulnerabilities and the prevalence within our systems. So the shell shock bug, bash, tends to be very prolific wherever we have Linux-backed systems. And then we've started to see hardware vulnerabilities starting to come. Broadpwn introduced the hardware vulnerabilities pretty prevalently as well. And Blueborn wasn't necessarily a hardware vulnerability as much as it came out of the RFCs, the originating documentation, and kind of showed a proclivity for vulnerabilities to come out, not necessarily because of a specific piece, but because of the documentation provided for implementation. So the intentions on how we're going to implement now created some similar vulnerability sets. And as of recent, I think we all know about Meltdown and Spectre. It's pretty much in the forefront of all of our minds at this point, how we're going to deal with this. And OT isn't exactly alone in that. A lot of the vendors are coming out and saying that it's affecting their products as well. So how do we deal with this, and how do we know that it's inside of our products? The lab took some smart meters, and we chose smart meters in part because there was a very quick deployment cycle. We kind of pre-positioned within the sector the idea that maybe some of these driving factors would be economic, schedule-based, things of that nature. So we took apart some smart meters, cataloged and libraried all of the components within them. We were really trying to find all of the components as deep as we could to really understand how we would build a library out of this, and then take that to the next step and say, now what is the crossover points? What is it that exists there? We ended up finding two sets, an M16C. Again, these were both different manufacturers. So we found the M16C, we found the MSP430, and it wasn't necessarily obvious at first, but as we started to look through it, it kind of looks like a lot of this came out of the reference specs by the equipment manufacturers. So they used a reference spec. They didn't really change some of the things that they didn't need, and that kind of reflects in, if I'm making a product and I don't need to change something, it works already, why am I going to invest in making that change just to make the change? So if I take the reference spec, I'm only going to change the portions that I need for my product to work in the way that I want it to. We then took the next step on this to look at these chips and ask ourselves, were there vulnerabilities out there that we could understand the impacts to our systems? So we started Googling. We never did identify at the time a vulnerability for the M16 chip. Just wasn't out there to be found. However, we did find that there was active research into the MSP430. Travis Goodspeed's been looking at these for years. There is active security research. So while there wasn't necessarily a vulnerability for it that we would highlight, we took this as there is research, there is probably eventually going to be a vulnerability that we're going to care about. So we liken all of this to trying to understand our components at a food label level. What is it that's harming us or potentially harmful to us as we're going through this, and how do we understand that in documentation? Are our vendors providing it for us? Who is giving us that information, or how do we obtain it? It's not really clear on that. So we decided to take the next step and say, how could we ascertain that for ourselves, or can we ascertain that for ourselves? Can we buy a product and get that information back out? So we purchased a Malware Kiosk. We purchased the Malware Kiosk almost entirely because it's not just a single component, it's not just a single product, but a collection of products. We can relate this to our OT, and our integrators are going to bring us systems, they're going to help us integrate it. Do they understand, or do they provide us the documentation that we need to understand all of the components within it? So we purchased the kiosk. We knew it was a collection of commodity equipment. We knew that the vendor was going to provide us documentation. We talked to the vendor up front. We obtained the documentation, and we told them that we were going to be pulling it apart to understand what was in it and test these assertions. We pulled it apart, started cataloging and librarying the chips within it again. But the first step that we took was to take each of the individual components at a macro level and try and understand whether or not there were vulnerabilities with them that we could ascertain just from what we had. So, for instance, it would tell us that, or we knew that it had a multimedia card reader in it. We knew that it had a CD-ROM, a screen, a computer backing it, the software going into it. So we tried to understand what software and hardware was in it, and then we tried looking for vulnerabilities. And as we did so, what we didn't find was really any vulnerabilities. The farther in we got, though, we did find the multimedia card reader. Again, couldn't find any published vulnerabilities by the manufacturer or anybody else that said this had a problem. As we pulled it apart, however, we found a Genesys Logic GL3220. We kept finding other chips. We kept doing the research on all of them. What was interesting about it, though, was as we did the research on the GL3220, what became apparent was there were people that believed it was vulnerable to BadUSB. The irony is not lost on us that a malware kiosk meant to protect from infections was itself vulnerable to BadUSB. We continue to look at this. Now, keep in mind, we did not look for confirmation that this was vulnerable. We simply took this and reported it back to the vendor. The vendor did report to all of their customers that this was there. We relied on them to do the confirmatory research if they decided to. That was not our goal. Our goal was to understand whether or not we could ascertain the hardware within it. Again, this was an important finding for us because it showed that there were potential vulnerabilities that we couldn't necessarily identify just strictly on the documentation. We didn't have that food label understanding of our components. Afterwards, we continued on to try and really extrapolate what is it that we need to understand and how do we go forward. So one of the key takeaways was that when we're looking at components, we need to understand that in a lot of cases, the reference designs are going to be used by multiple manufacturers if that's where they're getting their components from, with little to no modification where they don't need to. So this is an important consideration. If we can ascertain that that's what that is, we may be able to make extrapolations on that. Also, importantly, though, is that we're not saying this is good or bad. We're not trying to say that convergence is going to be the cancer of the future. I personally believe that there's really no right or wrong answer in this. It's going to have to happen. Market drivers and everything else are going to be part of what we have to deal with. So we have to incorporate this into our security paradigms. We have to incorporate this into how we're looking at our systems and just mature. In OT, with the smart meters, we're starting to see that if we thought that we were unique, we're starting to lose that novelty. That novelty is no longer there. So as we move forward, we're going to have to start accepting the idea that from-scratch development is a thing of the past. We're not doing it. And at this point, modern development is beginning with the idea of identifying key chipsets, key libraries, key software that's going into our products and building from there. And so we're inheriting whatever vulnerabilities come with that, and we're going to have to deal with that in some way. Last but not least, it's impossible for us to understand the scope of our vulnerabilities and the components within them until we start to get the documentation. Either we're going to have to self-build it, or we're going to have to rely on our vendors to build that for us and to give it to us. Without those, we're not going to have this detailed level of understanding of our components so that we can identify and understand whether or not we're vulnerable. With that, I'll open up to questions.
For the food label, you indicated that you would kind of list the possible bad things that were in there. Are you also going to have a list of ingredients when you go through this catalog and list all the different parts are in there so that vulnerabilities that later are found, the user can look up themselves?
So we're not necessarily putting that together. There are some industry efforts to try and do some things similar to that. There's software corollaries already out there. Mudge has put together his cyber independent testing lab, and they're trying to build out ideas of how to understand the software libraries. And there's lots of research on that effort. However, what we're not seeing is the corollaries happen for the hardware necessarily. And a lot of vendors tend to put that into proprietary information, proprietary technology, and say all the chipsets, all the designs, these are this is our secret sauce, right? I don't know that that necessarily lasts. I don't know that I would necessarily call it security by obscurity either. There's some logic to it, You don't want anybody to be able to just say, okay, let's put all the chips together and be done. So, but no, we're not putting together this library for general use. This was just a research project to try and understand the phenomenon.
Just thinking, if you've thought any about the future of how this should look. Like you say, the corollary is in software. We're trying to understand what libraries are used, what vulnerabilities may be there. Same, I think it's a great parallel in hardware. But as an end user, it seems like that's beyond the capability of the end user, and that you need to go to this FDA labeling, somebody else to provide this information for you. What are your thoughts along those lines?
I agree. And again, it's going to be a difficult problem set because, again, some people are very upfront about it. Some industries are very open about it. Some aren't. And sometimes we have understandings about our products that are easy to extrapolate. The Spectre meltdown revelations of recent are really interesting about that. We understand that ARM, AMD, Intel, they're all vulnerable to some portions of it, right? At least within Spectre. So how do we deal with that? I don't know, but we should be able to get to something that says this has an ARM processor in it. It has, these macro components so that we can have an understanding of what that means. But it's definitely something we have to ask ourselves, how do we mature, right? We have to figure that out.
And it also seems like it has a bit of its own rabbit hole about documentation is useful, but there could be errors or omissions that you would have to verify again.
Absolutely. And so if we take the kiosk, for example, one of the things that we looked at was what happens if the vendor itself that's producing that multimedia card reader switches out chipsets? I have no way to ascertain that. And maybe I can do that from a software interface on the PC that it's plugged into, but then how do I correlate that off to a PLC, right? It becomes an interesting rabbit hole. You're absolutely right.
And as this leads afield, it also, I tend to see when I pull things apart, sometimes people paint the chips or something to try to obscure them. And I guess that sort of leads kind of back to vulnerability disclosure, whether or not you try to hide a vulnerability or make it available. Any thoughts about hiding chip identity?
Not right offhand. I mean, again, I see the point in why a vendor will want to do that. That's some of their secret sauce, right? If I can take that and reproduce it, I can counterfeit or do whatever you want to call it to take their market share. I understand that side of it. It's not a clear-cut pathway. And, again, if I look at it from a supply chain perspective, it's really difficult to say, well, I know that this is existent because I may not be given that information by my upstream supplier of some sort. They may not know it. That was one of the things that we learned out of the kiosk report was they didn't really even know that was a possibility within their product. So it's really hard to look at it and say, here's the solution, but I don't think there's anybody to look at and say, here's how we solve it either. Somebody's going to have to take those looks, though.
No, I certainly think it's interesting, and it provokes a lot of thought along the way. I mean, we end up back to like revisions in chips and firmwares in chip and verifying that as well.
Yep.
So has INL changed any of their buying behaviors as a result of your research?
Not at present. We have not adjusted our purchasing behaviors at this point. I don't know if that's in the cards or not. That's outside of my scope of influence, I'll say. But we have at least taken a look at it to understand whether or not there is something that we should be changing. And I think that there's a long-term view out of that we will take.
Let me ask you a macro question then.
Sure.
Macroeconomic drivers. CPUs, many kinds of high-volume chip designs are, in a sense, natural monopolies. Everybody wants to be using the leader because it's the cheapest, it's got the most features. Entire industries full of decision makers on the software side have said, I don't want custom operating systems from my vendors anymore. I want Windows. This happened 20 years ago. The problem is that the defense in-depth strategy that most of us apply to our security systems is premised on no one security mechanism being perfect. And so we need layers of security, ideally different kinds of security, different kinds of technologies, different kinds of layers. Diversity is an essential part of defense in depth. If what we're seeing here is macroeconomic trends that for the last 20 years have eliminated diversity and are not going to go away. I mean, these trends don't go away. There's, more CPUs everywhere. There's 200 CPUs in the average car. There's more software everywhere. There's more connectivity everywhere. These trends have gone on for 30 years. If this is another one of these macroeconomic trends, what does it mean for defense in depth? Are we ultimately doomed and we need to do something different? And if so, what does that look like? What's the future look like here?
I guess the way I would answer that is that I agree that monoculture isn't exactly what we're after either. Trying to push into an area where we're saying we want the same of everything doesn't work. And yes, that cuts out layers of defense in depth. That's kind of what this research was trying to show a little bit, is those frailties that you can introduce. But at the same time, it's an evolutionary function. And so I think that you end up with diversity throughout it anyways. I haven't seen a single CPU provider dominate in any one way. Yes, Intel has a large market share. Yes, AMD has a large market share in other areas, ARM processors and so forth. But I don't think that you end up seeing a full monoculture develop out of that. And so I think that we still have that diversity. It's just not the same across the board.